Okay, good evening, everybody. This is a live stream of Douglas Dietrich Productions, and I'm going to be handing Douglas the link so he can publish to the Facebook timelines. Let's see here. Okay. Yep, and we're streaming. I can see.
Okay,
that,
there
YouTube,
we are.
YouTube has picked up our our live stream. So no one's connected yet, so we'll wait a bit.
Right. Okay. Okay, so let me get down there. Grab this from you, and there we are. We're going to hear some echo for a second. I go mute. I got one person already put a like up, a thumbs up. Cool. So there we are. So people are connecting. And I'm going to grab this link here. Make certain that
I'm going to switch to headphones.
That works.
So we don't get so much reverb. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good. Good. So I could hear you. 3 people gave a thumbs up now. And let me get over here and do what I need to do. Okay. And I'll just be making grunting noises. I'm actually going to ask my communications officer and executive producer, Mr. Pavel Pravala, to speak when we get to the top of the hour, so that we'll have the normal amount of people listening. And
so I noticed that from what I was reading, that it was the most boring Super Bowl ever. It was the butt of jokes, but so we called it correctly in that, you know, people were by far better off listening to our program and our transmission, as we scored definitely a lot more points than anybody else that night. Like the longest touchdown was took 2 yards to complete. So yeah. So if people want to see some real action, they should watch the Canadian Football League. There you go. So, yeah, we definitely call
There we are. There we are.
And yeah.
That's funny. That's thank you for sharing that. That's anyhow, there you go. Very glad to hear that. I mean, sad to hear that, but it's, you know, glad that it worked in a sense to our advantage. And let me get this up here.
Unpin this. Also, one thing I forgot to mention before we went to air, but I watched the State of the Union, and I'm gonna leave that up to you to cover if you are even gonna touch that. But a lot of interesting actually things that came out of that, as far as what you know, listeners of Douglas Dietrich. I hopefully picked up on what was going on and can definitely deconstruct that whole speech. I mean, he picked on. Yes. It was very interesting that he used D-Day, how much references was made to that, and how big a deal that was made of. And but I found, you know, people who listen to Douglas Dietrich, I hope they picked up on the ironies and the conflations. Actually, there was several conflations that I definitely picked up. So I'll leave it because I would discuss it, but I want to see if I'll first give you a chance to see what you think. But just letting people know that I did watch that.
Sounds great, and very gracious of you to let me take the lead on that. But actually, I would ask you to cover that a bit. Go ahead and touch on that a bit when we start at the top of the hour. I'll introduce you, of course, just because not many or many people who listen to us regularly, of course, they all know you, but I certainly want to introduce you to new listeners. So I'll introduce us at the top of the hour, introduce Pavel, and then we'll take it from there with Pavel taking the stage for as long as he needs to. which won't be too long. I'm sure his debriefing in everything altogether will be like 15 to 20 minutes at the most, but it'll be fine. And certainly we appreciated what he did the other night. Reactions to that were immediate. And I'll leave him to do the narrative on that, providest the descriptives. And then we'll take it from there after he does a little bit of follow-up with his impressions of the State of the Union. Because actually, it's important that you started off because you're a Canadian and you're looking at it from across the northern border, a wall which nobody speaks of. It's a wall of culture, a cultural wall. And so, other than that, yes,
for Canada,
let me get this link.
For Canada, it definitely has been a cultural war. The influence of American media on Canada, like especially going from my age, watching it from the 80s, moving up into the 2000s, the odds. It has changed dramatically. This is, there was, I would say that Canadian culture was actually quite a bit more distinct, at least what people thought of themselves as Canadian. I don't know if you meet a Canadian, and I wonder if you ask them what does it mean to be Canadian, if they are actually able to, if anybody's able to give that a proper thing. But I think a lot of people obviously would, they might say, oh, well, we're from Quebec, we're French Canadian, or we can be distinct. But I mean, something that they can actually really boil down to, they say, this makes me Canadian. I think you would get a lot of conflicting responses. But in Toronto, especially being a sort of the hub for movie making and a lot of American productions, the culture has unfortunately degraded into this sort of American, where the crimes that occur here now are more looking like people who watch American crime television, whereas a lot of this was actually not allowed. We have a national station called CBC, a huge media arm of the what is set up as a government, though they are like half independent and government funded, but they do get to do what they want for the most part, as far as I can. I don't watch CBC News that much, though I do like listening to the radio. They have a radio station. The CBC was set up to unite Canada, so I mean, but it's taking a lot of flack for not being being a government organization or something. But I think they've done a lot of good for Canada. But yeah, in Toronto, the crimes have been absolutely horrendous. The amount of guns coming in. I mean, right now there is on trial this Bruce McArthur. He's already got sentenced, pleaded guilty, and he killed. This is a horrible crime. He coaxed gay men out of the gay village here in College and Church Street. That's our sort of, it gets called Gay Village in the newspapers, and that's it's kind of straight downtown Toronto, and this piece of shit, he took out, he would coax men and then he would tie them up and hold them and eventually kill them, and he was kind of like a gardener. So he got away with these crimes, and he would bury the bodies in like planters and bury them in people's yards and stuff like that. And it took them there were 8 victims in total that died because of this. And I think they found out because one of them managed to get away. And once he tried choking someone, and the person went to the police, and the police didn't follow up properly on it, and could have probably got him earlier. And that police officer is also facing a trial as well now, or getting investigated. Yeah, he's facing jail till, he probably won't get out till he's 91 years old now. And the mayor of Toronto says he definitely hopes this person will never get out. But that's just one crime, and with 8 victims, they all look like they were ethnic people. A Muslim looked like one Canadian looking one, and I mean, I didn't read up on it. I find this quite disgusting, but this kind of crime, I don't know how common it was before, but not quite like this, where people are just this bold to, right in the city too, right in front of the police, daylight kidnappings and things. So, but I don't read up on it
Right.
as much as I can say.
Right.
Just citing it as an example of how things are changing. And I mean, we had that nut last year that rented a van and ran over people on Yonge Street on the sidewalk, just sort of driving up the sidewalk. This incel,
Right.
fuck of a man. So, yeah. And things like that, you know, stuff that you wouldn't really expect in Canada.
That's just terrible. Yeah.
Anyhow, looks like
Yeah. Well, definitely.
no, go ahead.
It's top of the hour. Yeah. So I'm going to introduce. Yeah, I'm going to introduce you, and definitely I want to thank Pavel for taking us into the top of the hour, and I definitely want to thank him for telling us just how here's a real cultural thread. You have American criminality, which is bleeding up north, and then they dare to bitch about what's coming from down south. It's just too ironic, and it's just part of the insanity, and it's very similar, of course, to the young white supremacists and all the many white supremacists who claim that there is no such thing as a shooting massacre, that all of these are false flags and nobody is dying. And they do this, and then they go out and they perpetrate mass shootings, and then in turn, more white supremacists will say that no mass shooting is taking place, and it's all false flag to take our guns away, and go out and kill more people. This is the horror that can go on infinitely if we tolerate it, and we cannot afford to tolerate it, or they will kill all of us. So definitely, I want to thank Pavel for that tangent of thought. And I'll introduce him now. Basically, I want to give a shout out to everybody tonight who helps us at all times. I'll do that after we've heard Pavel out, because he's I don't know if this will be nightly or with each transmission, but it's become certainly the pattern over these past few transmissions, and it bodes well for the future, whether or not it's per each transmission or not. It does bode well, because I've always wanted Pavel to participate more personally, because it is so important for the people I'm affiliated with to be known and to show themselves, and it's so much more courageous and earnest and sincere, just plain honest, than our gang stalkers who operate in a very different manner, where they never speak at all and only take all of my speech, resplice it, and then add commentary on a video screen. There's reasons for this. They've been instructed not to speak, because Aquino has indoctrinated them that their speaking on record will lead to lawsuits. But they're spiraling in that direction anyway, and have been for years. Only my lack of people who had the time and energy to participate has prevented me from pursuing lawsuits so far. But we will change that now at our discretion. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce my executive producer, whose responsibilities are now expanding into the realm of communications officer as well. So my primary public relations man, in a very real sense at this point, is Pavel Prevara. And with that, I bring him on to repeat his name the way it should be pronounced in the native Czech, and to take over the show for a good as long as he needs to. Take it away. Thank you so much for all your patience and your welcoming of Pavel Edward Prevara.
Oh, gracious thanks, Douglas. I appreciate the introduction and the accolades. Yes, I wanted to touch on a couple of things. Just actually, it'll probably be brief, because yes, I want to touch on people using the name of Douglas Dietrich and just work out, because I've been digging through YouTube's documentation, and I've been noticing I see that channels are using the name of Douglas Dietrich in their title and descriptions and so on, and I wanted to point out that YouTube, they themselves, so they have guidelines they mainly, these guidelines are based on legal precedent of a larger field of intellectual property. And so I wanted to mainly point out this. I'm going to use illustrate this with one channel that I found that's using the name and essentially inappropriately, or already it's alleging something false by the way it used the name Douglas Dietrich, which is a problem in itself. But it actually, and I will explain what more problem there is with that. So this channel that I'm speaking of is called Water Sign Water. Yeah, Water Sign Water. Okay, and maybe I guess she's Aquarius. But the channel titled its video, or her video, is, it starts off and it uses the name Douglas Dietrich, and it says Douglas Dietrich Hitler. So the problem with that is, of course, that Douglas is not named Douglas Dietrich Hitler. His full legal name, and I have to emphasize that in America and Canada, a name is a legal entity. That's why when at the beginning of our transmissions you see it capitalized, that in itself implies a legal ownership, essentially, of the name. Is how I'm seeing how they're gonna look at it, and so I wanna clarify how we proceed along the lines of people when we see this name. If a channel did not ask us, email us, or talk to someone and get a permission to use the name Douglas Dietrich, they cannot use it in their title or in the description. This is how the YouTube rules are laid out, and the consequence of that is that you essentially stand even a copyright transgression. So you would essentially have to get permission of Douglas Dietrich to use the name within your video. Now there are channels that do use our name, and they're affiliated channels. Or if someone, where it's different is if Douglas has done an interview, which he has done hours and hours and hours of interviews with other people, they themselves, because he agreed to the interview, have the permission to use the name. And that is, this is media to media, where Douglas Dietrich Productions allows the use of that name. But moving forward, I have to give this as a kind of a warning. As I say, I found this channel and it's using the name Douglas Dietrich Hitler, and we are offended by that, because Douglas's name is not Douglas Dietrich Hitler. That's one, but that's a minor offense, sort of. I mean, I think Douglas is probably, I don't know if he's offended, maybe it's a compliment, but it's legally false. You're making a false accusation to put that in a video.
Right.
So that channel actually stands to get possibly a from now on, we may be going through the copyright complaints as we're looking at this in a more detail and assessing the situation. Now there are channels that are affiliated with us, so if you want to see channels that that use our name, you will see them out there. One is Taboo Bros 2, which we often reference, and also now John Warrington, for instance, when he made his Brexit video, he let me know that the video is being made, and so he implicitly had the permission to use Douglas's name. And the reason is they communicate with us, and I know that if I asked him to, for instance, if we found something offensive, or if we felt that that it was, oh, sorry about that, if we did not agree with what was going on, then John Warrington does respect our right to ask him to pull that video down, for instance. I'm giving that as an example. There's no such thing is going to happen. As I appreciate what John Warrington does, because I find that I found John Warrington's videos creative. I do like the imagery that he uses, because it evokes the impact that what is actually being presented. And so I think he did a creative job as far as the videos go that he has created recently. And so this is why do give people a permissive, there is a permissive license on our transmissions, in that we encourage people to, it's called Creative Commons, and I have to stress creative. So even if you used it and you feel that this license gives you permission to use our videos as you wish, this is not so. I will, or we as Douglas Dietrich Productions will essentially pursue it if we deem it not creative. If it's uncreative, then we certainly don't want to be affiliated with you, and using the name Douglas Dietrich essentially takes away from our work that we're doing if you don't know what you're doing, or if we don't approve of what you're doing. And from what I've seen, the copyrights, the copyright holders, YouTube will side with the copyright holders. This is looking quite clear, actually. So any channels that do use the name Douglas Dietrich or Douglas Dwayne Dietrich need to pull that out, and you need to reference this anonymously. So for instance, this channel that says Douglas Dietrich Hitler, one thing is this, it looks like a lady because I see an image of a lady speaking, is she should just take the name out and just leave the rest, say call it deleting channels, colonization effects, and also take the name out of the description. You can leave the link to the video if you wish that she's referencing, that's fine, but using the name Douglas Dietrich is against our wishes, put it that way. To put it mildly, but it is a legal issue ultimately, and that is how YouTube will defer to a legal court if there is any escalated dispute, because it is a legal issue that's covered by law. And so I wanted to remind people that, and if you see a video that's using the name, you can let them know that it's up to us, and we will provide ways to contact us. Though we show Douglas's, Facebook and stuff. There are ways to contact us, even through YouTube. I do believe the emails do go to our main email channel, so or to our main email, Google email, that is. So that it's the first time I had to speak of that, and I might reiterate it in the future as I get more clarity on this. But this is a fair warning that without explicitly getting permission from us, or being affiliated with us, or you're not being a channel that has done an interview, then you do not have permission to use the Douglas Dietrich name. This is strictly reserved for the legal name, which is Douglas, obviously. So that's one thing, and or you have to reference the name anonymously. So you say, I don't know, I would say that, she can say, a discussion, I'm having a discussion about something I heard. Anonymous reference. You cannot use the name. I'm trying to make it clear, but I'm not sure if I will. Like I say, I will reiterate it as I get more clarity on this, it becomes more clear in my mind. Exactly, it is clear in my mind, but speaking about it is not clear. Anyhow, so that covers.
Right. Understood.
That covers that for now.
Yeah.
With the State of the Union.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I do want to Yeah, just wanted to say one thing before we go into the State of the Union with Pavel, is that Pavel is always very conscientious, and he's always very considerate. And so one of the things that he brought up is this channel. He didn't bring up, of course, that he said it looks like a female. He hasn't really gone over the video. He hasn't reviewed it. I have, with the one other video that I am aware of, that was put out by this lady who happens to be an older, middle-aged at least, African-American woman. So we're talking about a black African-American woman who took it upon herself to psychoanalyze myself about 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, she produced a video in which she said I was damaged basically by colonization. And that since I was damaged by colonization, I was overwhelmed with race hatred. Now, I found this, of course, to be absurd because, of course, I'm just someone who iterates the realities of history. And if I were to reiterate the narrative of history without the human impact, which would include myself as someone who's at least partially human or once was, then I would be remiss. And so it's absurd that for some reason, because I have empathy and I'm able to express it, that I am somehow damaged. So whatever world she's seeking is a white world order where there are no emotions, something similar to the Borg. I don't know what her fantasy is, but she's obviously very deranged herself because she's a black African-American woman. The overwhelming majority, unfortunately, of white men would look at her as just literally a piece of shit. And they would think of her as speaking or even holding opinions or voicing them as absurd and out of her place. So her attacking myself goes beyond that now. And what she does now is she basically says that I am becoming more fascist, which is kind of like saying I'm becoming more vampiroid in my characteristics. It's absurd because that is what I always was. In either case, I have never presented myself as otherwise. I have never said that I am not fascist. I hail from the last outwardly and proudly fascist nation on earth, the Nationalist Republic of China, the last standing member of the Axis powers on the surface world, as formally recognized by the United Nations and an enemy of the United Nations. I have ever been a proud fascist. So to say that somehow I'm becoming more fascist, then it's kind of like saying, oh, he's becoming more vampiroid when I was born with the genes. And therefore, we finally get a connection that actually rationalizes or justifies the otherwise somewhat surrealist and almost lampoonish title of John Warrington's video, Douglas Dietrich, Vampire Son of Adolf Hitler, or whatever it's titled, which people can find on the Maggot channel. And as Pavel said, the images that he uses are creative. The end result is it's all my own words. Now it's very different from that of my gang stalkers, who will just take my words and then put on screen something that is bizarre, absurd, and they will just do what they do. And everything they do is, of course, an attack. But it's bizarre because in the end, whether it's this African-American lady on her Aquarian water sign, water bearer channel, whether it is the Gunner 65, whether it is Rose Dio with her Mystic Warrior channel, the one thing that all of these people have in common is they're simply exploiting my name for clickbait. And they cannot get any hits aside from myself. If you look up Gunner 65, you're not going to find it. If you look up Mystic Warrior, you're never going to find it. If you look up this Aquarius water bearer, water sign channel, water sign water bearer, I believe, you're not going to find it. The only way you will find any of them is by adding Douglas Dietrich. And once you add Douglas Dietrich, suddenly you find them. And you still have to look. And so their entire existence is parasitical. And the irony here is that I'm simply, at this point in history, perhaps my entire life will permanently be not other than a micro-celebrity. There is no one on the street. If you bring up Douglas Dietrich, everyone will think they've heard of me because it sounds like a stage name, but they won't remember any films I've been in. So the conclusion will have to be drawn that I'm not an actor. They won't remember anything about me at all because everything about me has been scrubbed from the internet. So the only reason these people are trying to parasitize off of someone who is not even a celebrity by standard definition is because the system is actively working to destroy me. You can't draw any other conclusion, because there is no one else who has literally an active network of gang stalkers whose only purpose in life is to parasitize him while trying to destroy him. And think of the perversity of that. They need me to be alive in order to maintain their own pathetic existences, because their entire identity is wrapped up in attacking me. They cannot live without me. And yet they spend their lives attempting to destroy me. Now, digest that and then confront them. This is not my struggle. It's yours. They're trying to destroy you. And because I'm the only one, the only one within alternative media, all alternative media, all conventional media, the only person in all media who has given you a consistent, coherent narrative, they must destroy me. So they've set out suicide units. These people are expendables. These people, if they destroy me, destroy themselves. Like a torpedo. Like a suicide attack from a terrorist bomber. That's what these people are. Confront them as such. Destroy them. Confront them, attack them, destroy them. Basically, that means confront them with what they are. That will destroy them. When you confront them with what they are finished. They auto-destruct. It damages them more than anything else in the world, because they look in a mirror and they see pure shit, which is what they are. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pavel again so that he can build on that if he wishes, and if he so wishes, just move on forward with the State of the Union speech, because I definitely want to hear his impressions as a Canadian before I deconstruct it, as he knew all too well I would. So Pavel, blessings, my brother. Take the stage again.
So I will build on that, because there's one other aspect that I failed to mention. And but before I go there, I wanted to say that Bizarre HD left a comment on that the water channel, exactly doing that, confronting the channel about what was being said, and who, you know, just a stalwart. This person is really thinking, and he understands the logic of what's going on, exactly as you outlined just now, the various things. So kudos to Bizarre HD again. Very good to see that people are paying attention as to what's going on, and it's greatly appreciated. That, and I wanted to touch on this, actually. This is one aspect that I neglected to mention, is the one where it's really clear is you're not a channel is not allowed to use without permission a photograph of you or your likeness. This is definitely out of bounds.
Yes.
And I'm looking at it, and this is we're going to file it as a copyright strike. So if you see a channel, you can even bring it to our attention that uses a photograph of Douglas. The interviews that he does, these are the channels that have a photograph and were likely supplied to promote that interview, but that's it. This is quite clear. If you did not get Douglas's permission to use this photograph, you must take it off. This is you will get and I will actually get more severe. The filings will get more severe as time goes on, as I figure out what the best process and the quickest process to expedite the removal of any photographs out there is. So far, I've been kind of lenient in that I've been just filing privacy complaints, or on behalf of Douglas Dietrich Productions. But I'm realizing that it actually that the law is likely on our side here, especially copyright law. So if again, Taboo Bros, that's fine, using a photograph, and they have implicit permission, being an affiliated channel, we promote them. But outside of that, no, it is, and it doesn't matter. And YouTube is quite clear. It doesn't matter what you put in your description or what the channel puts in their description. If they want to claim that it's fair use, any of that, it does not matter. That is not. You did not create any implied permission, unless you asked us or you got the photograph through Douglas Dietrich production, or you're conducting an interview. And that's why Douglas does interviews with actually recognized media companies, or has done in the past, or people who have who have a track record of actually carrying out proper interviews. And that's why you don't see his photograph on anywhere else. Like when I'm looking at the screen right here, I see 911tv.org. That was an interview I saw with him that they allowed him to publish. But again, he represents himself. No one else is allowed to represent him, obviously. That I hope that that's clear, and that's going to be any channel that is using your photograph will be hearing from Douglas Dietrich production. Okay, moving on. Yeah, the State of the Union. I'm going to be just brief because I kind of like just made 2 points, and so I'm not sure if I'm how much depth I can give it. So I'm just going to give my impressions, and it's not so much my Canadian. I guess I'll see if the Canadian comes through. I didn't even think of that because I've been watching since the 2016 election. I watched some of the debates, and before that I didn't watch TV. I didn't even know how the American government worked properly. I didn't even know what Congress was properly. I mean, I know implicitly what it is, but I didn't even realize how the houses in America were divided up and how they came together. But so I've been learning a lot from yourself, Douglas, in what you've exposed, and mainly I remember you said your specialty is the Constitution, and so I've been paying attention to that, and I'm gonna go back actually to the previous transmission because I want to get a better understanding of how the World War II financial agreement, the Bretton Woods agreement and stuff, and how it all went from there. Because I was listening to it and I realized, man, this is quite intricate. The steps that the consequences that came from that. But so the State of the Union. My parents were watching it, so I kind of sat in and I started listening, and I was making I made a guacamole salsa while doing it to kind of like keep myself, and my mind was on something else, just so I mentioned that, and I was kind of half listening to it, and it started off like grand, as in it was all about unity and so on, but every media outlet pointed out that this is just talk, that in fact he already was divisive before the State of the Union and right throughout it in a way. But I want to point out that I found it interesting that he started off, individual number one here, that he started off with hearkening back to the Second World War, to things like D-Day, and but he said that America's innovation, this is what struck me as an irony, is that how much America innovated in the past and how much they're number one as far as productivity, and so productivity possibly, but apparently it's not even true, as from what I've seen in the last year anyway. But what I found ironic is that anybody who does listen to Douglas knows how World War II concluded, and I mean this isn't really a secret that that it was actually Germany and Japan who were the innovators, going through the war, being on the sort of defensive, or suffering quite a number of attacks, and facing possible invasions and wars from some superpowers like Russia and the United States, that they innovated quite heavily. And anybody who looks into sort of the secret technology of, it doesn't even have to be secret technology. I mean, what the Third Reich produced is, and the Prussian education system and so on, they were I would say they were the leaders, and I don't see why anybody would disagree. Going in, and that America actually mainly profited by appropriating a lot of this technology, as they did as and Japan forcing to open up America's markets also allowed a huge influx of Japanese technology into the American continent. So, I mean, this, and this was the start of the speech, the start of the State of the Union. So, that really struck me. That what I found interesting about that is that, that he used how big a role the historical narrative plays in these public forums, and would someone spectacles yeah, it was a spectacle, exactly, yeah. And so just that, if someone, whereas I knew the history a bit better, or I'm aware of a larger history than what individual number one was going on about, and so it seemed he very much like created this narrative of what people say, he essentially, it was to his base, which they will swallow it hook, line, and sinker. But the historical reality is quite different, is I would say, and I'll leave that one there. But the other, what I noticed is later on, quite a bit, I think maybe towards the end of the hour, the individual number one started citing how great these chambers are. He started making relations to the chambers and citing the houses, how much progressive legislature has been passed in the past. And so he mentioned things like civil rights, abolishing racism. But in that same, in these sort of liberatory adulations, he also mentions and building the railroad, right? Now, me knowing what you presented about the railroad, barren railroad robbers, I thought, okay, he's conflating, one disaster with the positive aspects of what they chamber. And someone who is just listening, I don't think would, or doesn't have the context, the historical context for what actually took, the genocide that took place because of the railroad, and the reasons for why it was built, and the fact that they stole the presidency to have it built, would miss that. And so my main point for bringing all this up is just, be aware how important knowing the correct history is, and having the proper historical context, how it changes what's being said and what's being presented. And so I'll conclude with that and let it move on. See, I'm interested in what you have to say, and how what takeaways you had. And happy Chinese. Now I'm very much interested in listening about the Moon Festival, as it's going to be huge in Toronto, obviously, and I'll try and make bigger participation in it. I'll venture down to Chinatown. There was a fire in Chinatown here today that they've been trying to take care of, and we had sleet and rain and snow today. So, but I will try and maybe take some photographs and do some journeying and report back in the future as the month progresses.
Bless you. Very deeply appreciate. Yes. Very deeply appreciate it. That was, of course, our executive producer, Pavel Edward Pravara, and he is now as well our communications officer. And I will try and conflate those two titles into something that's a bit more, how would I say it, euphonic, rather than saying separately. But he's definitely, his responsibilities have been expanding. The fact that I've been surrounding myself more and more with men is an ominous sign. It's essentially the nature of the war that we're fighting in, and make no mistake about it, the genders have developed roles. There are many reasons for many of those roles to be overturned. There are biologically indisputable advantages that both genders have. And I've always stated that the female is generally the superior species. And if you want to count men and women as the same species, which, if you ask me, is almost, I would almost go for articulating that they may very well have different sources of evolution between them, and they simply merged and came together as evolution progressed. But one of these days I'll go a bit more into that, and it's not pseudoscience. It's simply science that has outraged so many anthropologists that they've had to basically squelch or just scrub the primary advocates of such theses from their realm, from their paradigm. And but one of these days I'll go a bit more into that. Basically, I'm talking what is known as the aquatic ape theory, which some people have stated actually applies to females as being essentially porpoises and the cetaceans that have learned to survive on land and have evolved. And then you have the men who are more like degenerate apes. But though I'm always hard on men, the reality is there are functions for which they are both needed and for which they are unsurpassable. And that one of those functions, the primary function for which men evolved, with their enormous amount of aggression and testosterone, is war. And I remember one of my late and sainted sire's observations. My father, the man who raised me, George Joseph Henry Dietrich, the combat sailor, he had always told me that when there is a sudden baby boom of boys, when boys become the predominant wave of children being born, he always told me that's a certain sign that there's going to be a war. And he had learned that, of course, as an old wives' tale is the term they used to call that. He himself said that's an old wives' tale. And but we are not in a realm where that is an inappropriate comment. One of the most popular television series in the world right now, aside from The Man in the High Castle, is The Handmaid's Tale. And if you want to see where The Handmaid's Tale has been realized, you just need to turn towards the very people, the Axis powers, my fascist nations that produced myself culturally. I am a product of their culture. What we were struggling against when we fought the motherfucking Russians. And what they bring to you today is the realization of The Handmaid's Tale. And they're trying to realize that here in your United States. We'll cover that today. That'll be all part of deconstruction of the State of the Union. In the meantime, want to give some shout outs first to some wonderful people, parts of Team Dietrich, Team Dragon, Team Dietrich, lovely, wonderful grandmother Ramona Halitha Henry, foremost and always in terms of immediate help that she provides in so many ways, including, of course, being monitor for the closest that we have to a chat room, my personal friends page on Facebook. Do check out her Gold Star. Our dear executive producer, our brother in battle, Pavel, will share that onto his own Facebook timeline. That will actually make it easier for people to access. And that Gold Star is what our Ramona Halitha Henry appends various links to that throughout the program as long as she can with us. And so wonderful hugs and kisses to that lovely lady. This isn't, of course, only Asian Lunar New Year. We're also heading towards Valentine's Day season. And, of course, that reminds me of my magnificent Volcano Crown Princess of the Pacific, Judith Agert. Shout out to the lovely lady Judith Agert, my correspondent out of the Garden Island of Kauai within the archipelago of the Hawaiian Islands. Hope to have her again on sometime soon. We will have Peter Moon on next week, exactly 7 days from today, on the 13th. We will have him on Wednesday the 13th in my transmission, and Peter Moon and I can finally go to town alone without adult supervision. So that may be a race to the bottom, but if if we have any indication from the last time, I had a bunch of men hanging out, but people seem to enjoy it, so that's what counts. And aside from that, a shout out to everyone and anyone who I otherwise forget. Mark Frack, Daniel Arola, our dear brother in battle, Justin White, both of them former guests on my latest transmission, which I hope everyone will avail themselves of. I've got to get the top site or topics covered in this episode out for the transmission before that, shortly after this transmission. So do always go back to check those links. We will probably post them all again or repost them in kind of like a flurry of links so that people can avail themselves of all of that, or people can just visit, of course, the Douglas Dietrich channel. Aside from the Taboo Bros 2, which is, I do remind my communications officer, Pavel, to remember that whenever we speak of Daniel Arola, the channel is Taboo Bros 2, Bros being spelled B-R-O-S, and Taboo being spelled T-A-B-O-O, Taboo Bros 2, and that's where he has all the drive-by, shall we say, verbal shootings. And what we have with Jonathan Warrington, the Maggot Man, Grand Maestro of Team Dietrich, is the production of his own videos and that he puts together, and he also is, of course, the Maestro of Maggot Channel, the Grand Magator. And you would access, of course, mine own videos on his station, so to speak, his YouTube channel, and the archives. You would access all of the Dietrich archives at tinyurl.com/showsdd. So always remember that, tinyurl.com/showsdd. Remember that he could use some help because, of course, he spent at least $2,000 on the Maggot channel, shall we say, the technologies that he uses to make the Maggot channel possible. And the way that you can help Mr. Jonathan Warrington is either via PayPal, and that can be sent to his personal electronic address, financial support via PayPal, to John_war@hotmail.com. John_war@hotmail.com. Of course, if you're in England or any place that uses the Greater British Pound Sterling, you can send him pounds through the button marked with the pound sign. And this is not the hashtag, mind you, that can be confusing, but the British Pound Sterling sign in the upper right-hand corner of Facebook on the private messages box, and you can send him money via that. His Facebook timeline address, if I remember correctly, is www.facebook.com/John.war. And there you go. That'll take you there. And as for Douglas Dietrich, of course, do remember I also can use all the help that you can provide, always seeking sponsors. And so anyone is welcome to contact my executive officer, Mr. Pavel Edward, about that via his own Facebook timeline, which I'm actually going to look up at the moment. Let me take a look at how we reach Pavel. And, of course, he's got his own timeline address at www.facebook.com/pi342, pi342. I don't know if that's a mystic numeric code or something that his family used to communicate with people behind the Iron Curtain with, kind of like a secret frequency. But one of these days he can give us some details on that. Aside from all of that, definitely we will start our transmission in earnest now, and it's about 5:45 post-meridian Pacific Standard Time, and it's time to get vicious. Now, before we get too vicious, there is a young lady. This is, I don't know how to frame this. It's not a shout out per se. She's hard to describe. I interpret her as an inherently and intrinsically positive person, or a person who wants to do. It's not particularly a malevolent individual. There's a tragic backstory between us to extent, though in another sense there is no real backstory between us. But I guess I'd have to say there is to extent. And that's Heather Holman. And Heather Holman is a young lady who basically was someone who paid a lot of attention to myself. And she was, in a sense, someone paying attention to myself in a manner that I felt was unhealthy for her. And so I wanted her to establish a life of her own. So I severed all communications with her. She used to volunteer her time with Revolution Radio, back when I was affiliated with the madman Mike Ringley. And at that period of time, when her overtures became a bit too intense for everyone, including all of my affiliates at the time, and I severed communications with her, then she became outraged enough, hurt enough, where she felt that she could turn towards the man she felt knew me most to perhaps help her reestablish contact. And with that terrible, I would say, sense of anti-logic, that terribly irrational, motivation, that emotional motivation, she passionately approached Michael Aquino. And one thing that I've always forewarned people about, please, for your own sake, do not go seeking Michael Aquino. If you seek him, unfortunately, you will find him. And it'll be as if he was always there. And he'll know more about you than you ever thought it possible for someone to know about you. And when she got into contact with him, and this is a bit of a backstory that might take us to the top of the hour, they apparently became very acquainted. And I am only speculating, but they may be physically intimate. The one thing that I can tell you definitively, and this is a horror story I related last night to my dear friend Keith Call, who we're going to try and get on my program as soon as possible in the near future. The biggest problem is technology. Keith Call is younger than I am. He just had his 50th birthday. Shout out to Keith Call. I know he doesn't regularly listening, but God love him. And he's a brother in battle all the way. And he's the archivist at Wheaton College, and which is, of course, an evangelical university. He works in the building that was established through the financial sponsorship of Billy Graham. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily a positive. I'm not effusing. I'm just giving a historical fact there. But they are on a campus that was part of the historical Underground Railroad, where they were liberal and progressive enough to be antithetical to chattel slavery. So they have a background which is reputable in the best sense. And but he is, we'll get his opinion on everything, hopefully at some point. The problem is we'll have to figure out a way to, if at all possible, bring him on via phone, or we're going to have him establish a Skype account on his computer, and which, we don't need to go into all the personal detail of that. Pavel and I will discuss that later. But and I'll give him the particulars that will be the challenges we'll be dealing with. But when I spoke to Keith Kahn last night and was catching him up on everything, we hadn't spoken that intensely in probably almost 2 years. When I was catching him up on everything, one of the things that we were bringing up was Heather Holman, and this all connects. It brings us back to the Asian Lunar New Year, and it brings us back to Trump in the State of the Union speech. Unbelievably, it all does. It's all connected, the narrative. When I was speaking to him about Heather Holman, and of course he was asking, how did you find out more about Heather Holman and whatever relation she might have established with Aquino? And I told him, at first it was all anecdotal. And he and I just had kind of a supernatural experience, almost bordering on as if we were psychically connected in one way or another. And he had just gotten up to literally go to the bathroom, was aware, of course, that I'm usually up throughout the night and slumber through the sunlit hours. He was thinking about giving myself a call when I essentially butt dialed him by accident when I went to relieve myself in the bathroom. And while I was taking a piss, just basically picked up the cell phone to provide some nightlight for myself in the bathroom and see what time it was. And I knocked somehow automatic dial and called him. And so that was reestablishing of our communications in the most synchronous sense. And he had told me at the moment that I had called him, other than the thought entering his mind, since he had gotten up to go to the bathroom, that he should take advantage of being up and call me. Other than that thought, there was no thought in his head. That his mind was totally blank. He hadn't even begun to process thought. And then we went to the phenomenon that is published in a book, published in the 1970s or very early 80s, the title being Phone Calls from the Dead. And at that time, our entire communication system was still completely dominated. There was no such thing as the internet. It was still completely dominated by dial-tone phones, dial-a-phones, which no one even sees anymore, other than in places of business, where, of course, they're a necessity. But at that period of time, one of the phenomena covered in that book was that people will wake up first thing in the morning, and that's the time for this phenomena when it usually would happen with the old dial tone networks and the old, high wires that were in the telephone poles. Back in those days, when people received phone calls from the dead, it would usually be when they just woke up, weren't even beginning to process the world around them, just sat up, and their mind was blank. And at times like that, they'd get a ring, and it would be a dead lover, a dead relation, a dead friend. But that was when that phenomena usually took place. So when we were speaking of that, it was relevant because of the nature of the people we were talking about. And when we spoke of Heather Holman and her latest comment that she had entered, which I think, we'll publish it. We'll let it publish at our leisure on the YouTube channel. It was our latest YouTube video. Her comment should be up for everyone to read within a matter of hours, but it's no big deal. She says something that's fairly cryptic to anyone who's not familiar with me. And so it goes to show you how deeply she's been following myself and exactly how much she knows about the nature of Asian occultism. It's almost a statement to show me that she has graduated to a level of occult understanding that most Westerners couldn't dream of. And so that's intriguing. And when I was talking to our man, Keith Call, about this, and we were talking about how we got communications again so synchronistically, then I told him that's the first time I had heard about Heather Holman after I had broken off all contact with her was through an experience like that with a Facebook follower of mine, a friend and a fan who I never knew very well, never met personally, but lived across the bay in Oakland, within the greater San Francisco Bay Area Metroplex region. And this lady living in Oakland said that she had entered that very space while doing laundry in her own home. And because she was in her own home and she was doing the most boring thing in the world, watching the dryer churn the clothes like watching paint dry, she fell into basically a trance-like state, was not processing any thoughts. Her mind was open. And into that open space, nature abhors a vacuum, or even abnature, or abnormality in the supernatural sense, supernature, took advantage of it, and in her range of vision, walked Michael Aquino, like he was entering her own residential washroom. And so as the tales go, that the vampire cannot enter unless you invite him. Of course, that doesn't apply to genuine physical vampirism. That's a mythos, a mystique that developed around sorcerers who often present themselves in a vampiroid mystique, with a vampiroid persona. And a persona is a maskarovka, a mask. So when people project a personality type as I'm a vampire for the mystique of it to try and gain a cult following, that would be the nature of Michael Aquino, and he followed through on the mythos of it by he did not enter her room totally and invasively. He just lingered at the corner, and she sensed him, recognized who he was, having listened to my expositions and followed up on them with research on the net. And so she invited him in, which, by the way, I think is totally unwise and don't advise to anybody. But she invited him in, and he walked into her space and just was like observing her environment. It wasn't as if he was asking anything, presenting anything. He was just there. And she said he was accompanied by this very frightened young lady who was cowering behind him. And Heather Holman, it must be said, has a congenital condition of very large eyes, bug eyes. And to my shame and disgrace, I forget the medical term for the condition, but it was suffered by Marty Feldman, the comedian, who made a career out of the fact that his eyes look like a pair of fried eggs in a frying pan. And this individual, because he had been laughed at all of his life, made a career of it and became a comedian, starred in movies, and finally earned enough money to have plastic surgery to alter his physiology so his eyes would no longer be so comedically repulsive. And after that, no one would hire him because they only valued him for that trademark physical trait, that feature, that deformity. And thereafter, he killed himself because he couldn't find jobs in media anymore. It was so sad, so tragic. Well, Heather Holman has that distinctive feature. And other than that, she's got a killer bod, which she tends to emphasize in her photographs. And this young lady who was with the keynote, I asked this woman, what did she look like? And she said, well, she had eyes, just bug eyes, like two fried eggs in a frying pan. And I said, oh my God, that's Heather Holman. So there was an anecdotal experience that suggested, on the basis of that she truly was following up in her sorcerer's apprenticeship, her acolyte status with Michael Aquino. But the clincher came with, of course, Christine Joanna Hart. Now, Christine Joanna Hart is an honest-to-God historical level spy. So the lovely Lena Shea, fangirl, shout out onto her, says that that's Graves' disease. It may be, yeah, it may be. I didn't hear that term affiliated with that before. It might be a factor. I'll check into that. I'll follow up. I think that I didn't know if Graves' disease is probably congenital as well. So I'll follow up on that. Thank you. Thank you. Now, when it came to Christine Joanna Hart, and this brings back so many memories because Christine's a lot like the kind of background of the first woman I ever had sex with, the woman I lost my virginity with, when all of my blood was taken out of my body and I was given a full body blood transfusion without my permission. I was 14 years of age, and at that time I suffered bleeding duodenal ulcers based on all the stresses that I was suffering involved with the gang warfare of the Asian underworld, where I had found a place for myself. In terms of all of the massive stresses that I've been confronted with all of my life, all parcel this story, all important to the narrative. When I was growing up in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, the worst ghetto in the world, one of the ways that I adopted to the fact that it was the cheapest place to parole felons, and it was used as a dumping ground, a toxic waste site for the unwanted of society, whether it was prostitutes or paroled child rapists. I grew up in an environment of constant and total predation and violence. And one of the ways that I dealt with it was to join an Asian gang, an actual gang involved in criminal enterprise. Now, this is why I know so many of the Southeast Asians today, personally, who are being deported. So when I was dealing with the stresses of that, the fact that there were many so-called heterosexual men who in prison develop a real taste for dominating young men, for just aggressive homosexuals who very much appreciated my physique because it was so effete, so effeminate, whether I was throwing off these kinds of advances or dealing with the out-and-out sexual assaults, the attempted assaults thereof, I found the best way to deal with it was by going drag, by comporting myself as if I were a member of the opposite sex. And this is why I have earned the right, having experienced life as a female in so many situations. I, more than any other male on earth, aside men like myself, have the right to speak to women's issues. And this is why I articulate them so well. So when I was dealing with those stresses combined, they led to massive bleeding duodenal ulcers. And then what happened was when I was admitted to Letterman Army Medical Center, and it's very important to remember, Letterman Army Medical Center trained 25% of all U.S. Army doctors. 25% of all military doctors were trained at Letterman Army Medical Center in San Francisco. And because of this, they had a need for human experimental fodder. So they had an unholy alliance with the California prison system. And the most expensive, or the most highest paid constabulary in the world is, of course, the California Prison Guards Union. They make SWAT team. They make more than any other police department on planet Earth, no matter what dangers they face. The highest paid police force in the world is the California Prison Guards Union. And so when I was going to Letterman as a child, being medically treated, I would see prisoners being brought in handcuffs, chained at the ankles, by military police, volunteering for experiments that quite often, indeed more so than not, would end their lives. And so they were volunteering because they were offered, if they were on death row, a revocation of their death sentence, a gubernatorial pardon if they survived. If they had lesser sentences, they were offered a shortening of sentences and further factors for plea bargaining, etc. It's almost community service counted. They were also offered, if they were just short timers, prison privileges like cigarettes or access to pornography. They were allowed to subscribe to pornography in prison. So you add these privileges and all the way up to revocation of sentences for experimental volunteerism. And many of these people, of course, died. Ultimately, what had happened was this was compounded by the geopolitics of the world, because my life has always been intrinsically connected to the geopolitics of the world. Now, whereas before, my gang stalkers would dismiss that experience of my life as being some kind of Forrest Gump phenomenon, which is pretty bemusing when you think of the fact that most Americans are so historically illiterate, they interpret Forrest Gump to be a documentary. That's an actual fact. When interviewed, most people thought Forrest Gump was a documentary. Today's listeners, the younger people among us, don't even know what Forrest Gump is or was, and they don't need to. It was very much a dated period piece. It has no relevance whatsoever to the postmodern world. But when it comes to what was going on with why that matters, how all this connects, when it came to the prisoners and how they were being exploited, that was one of the reasons I also got the Presidio military base closed down for. It wasn't just all the child trafficking. It was the human experimentation. And I don't believe I've emphasized that enough in my lifetime narrative. This is where it gets quite offensive to me and quite unbelievably abusive, is when we get to the point where people disbelieve what I say when the circumstantial evidence is so profound and undeniable. We have on the loose, this all being part of the narrative, in the world today, a mass murderer, a MD, who got his medical degree in the United States Army, named John Henry Hagman. And this is not defamation of character. This man has been put on trial for his crimes, and he is still loose today. Now, all you need to do is look up his name, John Henry, and Hagman is spelled Hagmann. Hagman, Hagmann. And you'll find that Dr. John Hagman, MD, this emergency medicine physician, he is someone who retired from the United States Army in the year 2000. And of course, his license to practice was suspended by the Virginia Board of Medicine because for decades, this military doctor was conducting grotesque experiments of no medical value in which he forced his own medical students to participate in combat field injury experiments where he was trying to demonstrate that he could bring the dead back to life. So what he conducted were full body blood transfusions. And he would empty his medical students of all their blood and then repump it all back in quickly enough where they could be declared legally dead and flatline on record, be clinically diagnosed as dead. And then he would reanimate them by pumping all the blood back in. Now, of course, because he was using frozen plasma, they would be in such excruciating agony as that chill blood poured in and coursed through their veins. They would reanimate screaming with the agonies of hell. And this was his orgasm in life, his sexual thrill. But of course, many volunteers for death from out of the California prison died at his maniacal hands to the point where his murder ratio equals that of the other character in this narrative, the spoiled Muslim princess of Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto. So what had happened at the time that I had this bleeding duodenal ulcer, what had happened at the time that this madman was still active duty in the United States Army, before he became an independent military contractor, what happened was that Hillary Clinton had been in Oxford. She was a member of a sorority known as Hell's Harlots. And her sorority sisters were two of the most powerful women in the Muslim world. Her sorority sisters were Tansu Çiller. And Tansu Çiller was from Turkey. She became the prime minister of Turkey. She was so butch, she made her husband take her last name in a Muslim nation, no less. Her other sorority sister was the incredibly pampered Muslim princess known as Benazir Bhutto. Now, Benazir Bhutto was the princess of Pakistan, and the Pakistani royal house still ruled up until the 80s. And what had happened was that after they had all graduated from Oxford, went their different ways, and maintained very close contact, then Hillary Rodham Clinton was married to William Jefferson Clinton, and he was governor of Arkansas. And at that period of time, he helped crash the world blood market. This was a period of time when the blood banks were taking blood from any volunteers, anyone off the street, and they would pay them money, like $20 for every pint of blood. So all the crack whores, all the crackheads, all the street people who just were living off of night train wino juice, all these people lined up all over the United States to give their blood for money. And what happened was when all this blood was collected and distributed, eventually, of course, inevitably, inescapably, people began to die. And one of the people who killed more than anyone else was William Jefferson Clinton. As governor of Arkansas, he raised the ante by holding blood drives throughout all of Arkansas state penitentiaries. So prisoners would be given packs of cigarettes, access to porn, other petty prison privileges, more time in the yard, whatever, for donating blood. And so they all lined up to donate. Everybody donated in the prisons, and they're all fucking each other. This was at a time when we were rampant with AIDS. We didn't just have HIV positive conditions. We had full-blown AIDS. It was a death sentence. These men were literally dying in prison of AIDS, so many of them. The rest had chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, every sexually transmitted disease you can imagine, all pumping it into each other all day long. And so all that in such a mass amount, all corrupted, crashed the blood market, and Clinton knew he would do it. Hillary called up her friend, the princess Benazir Bhutto, and said, hey, we just crashed the blood market, baby. You can make yourself a killing. You run a country, and your military's tested all the time for their blood in terms of its quality, like any modern developed nation does with its military. Testing's done on the blood to make certain these guys aren't going to infect each other with various diseases, because militaries are essentially an armed and uniformed imprisonment, a detention in which men ultimately wind up fucking and raping each other. So to prevent them from infecting each other the way they do in the prisons, the military men are given regular blood tests. This is in any modern developed service in general, unless the culture is such, like in the Empire of Japan, where that's just not going to happen. Men aren't going to be raping each other because that's just not part of that culture. Now, in terms, by the way, I'm speaking in a military setting. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in the Empire of Japan. I just mean in the military setting. That's not the norm. That it's an alien concept to that paradigm. Now, when we come to the convergence of all of this, what happened was that Benazir Bhutto was the heir to a ruling dynasty of a nation that had had massive wars with a superpower known as India. In the destruction of the Raj by the Japanese Empire in World War II, the British were forced to surrender self-rule to Congress India, and it bifurcated immediately into Muslim and non-Muslim majority states. And the two largest majority Muslim areas of India became Bangladesh and Pakistan. Pakistan and predominantly Hindu India, Hindu cosmology India, where they worship the ancient gods of the Asian Indian pantheon, the Vedic pantheon. They and the Muslims went to war 5 times before the 1990s. Between 1945 and 1995, there were 5 major motherfucking wars between India and Pakistan that almost went nuclear. These were both nuclear powers. They both developed thermonuclear weapons. They both had the bomb. And the largest armored clashes, just like I said with the Japanese in World War II, that being the Leningrad and Stalingrad of World War II on mainland Asia, where there were massive armored clashes between the Japanese forces and their tanks and the British using Lend-Lease, American-manufactured Sherman tanks. In the Indo-Pakistani wars, the largest armored clashes of tank warfare occurred in those 5 Indo-Pakistani wars. They were as large as anything that took place in World War II. So the largest armored conflicts, clashes of armor after World War II occurred in those Indo-Pakistani wars in the Thar Desert, the killing field of the tanks. And the world almost went to nuclear war with each of these conflicts. So you have these 2 regional superpowers at loggerheads, and the Princess of Pakistan said, we're heading towards a 6th Indo-Pakistani war. And I want our men to have a blood supply available that they're going to need when this war comes to pass. So her military said, yes, Your Highness, what is it you wish? She said, I want 20,000 volunteers and I want a pint of blood from each. We'll have 20,000 pints of blood on hand. So 20,000 volunteers lined up. Then she gave the medics, the corpsmen, secret standing orders, entirely separate from the rest of the chain of command. A direct command from the House of Pakistan. And instead of taking one pint, when they strapped the volunteers down on the gurneys, the medics took 12. They strapped them down and drained them dry. They killed 20,000 men in a single shot, emptied them of all their blood. And while millions died all over the world because of the tainted blood supply, ultimately because of the diseases they spread after they contracted them from tainted blood to their other victims as well, when all this mass death was going on, brought about by the likes of the blood banks and the Clintonistas, Benazir Bhutto showed up on the world stage as a deliverer, saying, I've got the cleanest blood in the fucking world, all tested for every disease you can imagine, and it's yours for a price. The millionaires lined up, anybody who could afford it, their lives were on the line, they paid everything. Benazir Bhutto wound up with hundreds of millions of dollars. And then her military woke up and said, bitch, we're going to hang you by your own intestines. So she vacated the premises, moved to London, where she stayed for the next 20 fucking years. And then when Hillary Rodham Clinton was running against Barack Obama, Hillary called up Benazir and said, hey, I'm going to be president. She was so confident she was going to win. She said, you can go home now and we can run the heroin trade together because Pakistani troops occupy Afghanistan. We can process that into the high-grade heroin, as they always do in Pakistan, sell it to the rest of the world, and we'll orchestrate our efforts with my troops moving in to help you against insurgents. We'll all get in on the cut, and we'll dominate the world with the narcotics market. Well, Benazir Bhutto was stupid enough to bite. And when she went back to Pakistan, I told everyone she was going to die. As soon as she started exiting that jumbo jet, that passenger plane, a man with a suicide backpack threw himself at the foot of the little staircase that they lower from the plane, and at least 250 people died. She survived that. She got into an armored car immediately, started being taken towards her home, her old estate. Another suicide bomber with a suicide belt on dove underneath her armored vehicle, blew himself up, and she died the way so many American soldiers die in Afghanistan and Iraq, by an TBI, a traumatic brain injury, due to an IED, an improvised explosive device. In other words, like when the American Humvees run over a landmine and the American troops are inside even with their helmets on, it's worse. The improvised explosive device blows the vehicle up into the air, and they're blown up into the vehicle, and their heads hit the roof. And if their helmets are on, it compounds the fracture of the head, and it cracks open their skulls with a traumatic brain injury. This is how so many Americans die in those war zones. That's how Benazir Bhutto died. The man threw himself under her armored vehicle, blew himself up, even though the vehicle was armored and absorbed the shock, and she wasn't killed by the explosion. She died when she was thrown up and her head crashed into the armored roof and cracked her skull open, and she died with a traumatic brain injury. Now, this is why she died, whereas a bunch of ignoramus pundits in the United States were saying she died because she wore lipstick, and they didn't approve of that. Bullshit. So when I was losing all my blood at the age of 14, with this going on geopolitically all over the world, Dr. John Henry Hagman approached my parents and said, your son's going to bleed out and die. And I know for a fact, when I looked through my own records, later in my life as a Department of Defense librarian, he was lying through his teeth. He made it all up. He told my parents that and said, you can let him die, or you can let us do a full-body blood transfusion. And of course they opted for the transfusion, and then he told them, well, we have no human blood. The human blood market has crashed. We don't even have it in the military. All we have available is an experimental nanoplasma, a term never heard before. At that time, one that hadn't even made it to print in popular culture. And my parents said, do whatever it takes. And he let him know again, all the prisoners we've tried this on have died. But we think your son, because he's only 14, his body's pliable enough, he's young enough, he may recover, he may survive. His body may adapt and take on the experimental plasma. And of course they said, whatever you say to him, whatever chances you have to take. And so he emptied all the blood out of my body like he did with so many people. His kill ratio is about 20,000 mass murdered. The same as Benazir Bhutto. A statistic he was always proud of. And I died. When they pumped the full body blood transfusion of nanoplasma into myself, it didn't take. It killed me. And I was dead for at least 24 hours. I'm told 48. Flatline, clinical, I wasn't there. And when I reanimated, I had changed from my old blood type, which was my mother's blood type, the rarest in the world. Rh negative O, O negative, to one of the most common blood types in the world. I was suddenly reversed in my blood polarity. I was O positive, almost a universal donor. And then when I get freaks, ignorant naysayers, saying, oh, Douglas Dietrich is lying. He's not half machine. He doesn't have artificial blood. All they have to do is look up this man's history, his criminal record. And how can they say that I'm fabricating fact? And of course, because it was artificial, it took months for my bone marrow to process that artificial blood into something even similar to human blood, where enough of my own organic components were coursing through my veins, where I looked human again. Because when I reanimated, I was pale as death. The blood plasma, the nanoplasma was white. I was white, the color of death in Asia. So all Asians ran from me, screaming the moment they saw me. I was considered to be a ghost, a gui, a vampire. The only one who could love me was my mother. But I earned the reputation through my white coloration, used to my advantage. In the Chinese underworld, I became known as the White Widow because, of course, presenting myself as female the majority of the time, it being so much easier to literally get away with murder as a woman, as a girl, than as a male of any age. Then did I become known to the terror, the fear of all those in the Zhuye Zhongwen, the blood Chinoi, the Tongster or Sino-gangster circles, as Bai Guafu, the White Widow. And so I was perfectly aware of so many of these challenges of what happens to people in so many situations. And then it was increased, my awareness, by what they did to me afterward. It took 2 weeks for me to rehabilitate. A fortnight, a fortnight, 14 nights, and a cult term, which I learned when John Henry Hagman came in to check on me personally, following my case with deep interest and glee, to tell me there was a man who was also personally watching my case, a sorcerer of great repute, a man who someday would be my master. And that was the first time I ever heard the name of Michael Aquino. And then they wanted to see if my body had adopted the plasma to the point where I could function like a normal man or a normal male. So a woman came in, a young lady, to have sex with me every night for the 2 weeks I spent in rehabilitation. Now, this young lady never had a name. Her case prepared myself for the case of Christine Johanne Hart. Because this young lady, all of her life, had only ever been referred to as bitch or cunt or by a numeric alphabetic combination. Where she came from, where she was going, was forever lost to her. It wasn't even her concern. She was just adrift in a current she had no control over. Where she came from was all in her NSA FEMA jacket, the National Security Agency, Federal Emergency Management Administration file that might inform generations to come someday, if anyone ever found it, of who she'd been and all she'd ever done. Until that too was reduced to ash in some future, she prayed all-consuming conflagration. Because she prayed on a daily basis for the end of the world, so her own suffering would pass. Now, like I myself later, as a DoD librarian, would see my own files. Her jacket told how she was a foundling raised by nuns in a Catholic orphanage in Maryland. The nuns were members of a stringently reactionary order whose fixation on sins, venereal and medieval discipline bordered on the obsessive. She'd been routinely whipped for the most minor infraction, and with enough heavy-handed liturgical ritual to cause her to decide in retrospect it was, in reality, a degree course in high ceremonial sadomasochism. The nun's piety never, however, of course, stood in any way of their cutting a lucrative long-term deal with some CIA black operations people to supply that agency with children, especially the older and unwanted females and the more androgynous little boys, for purposes that had to remain hidden beneath the dread blanket of national security. All of that was the background she came from that I found out about while making love to her every night, the woman who introduced me to sex. She had never known the exact criteria that had decided her fate in life. Seemingly, the nuns had decided when she was little more than an infant that her soul was lost forever, and she'd been placed on a list. And one dark night, she and 2 other girls from the orphanage were heavily tranquilized and bundled into the back of a formidable armored Lincoln with tinted windows. And after a hallucinatory ride, she arrived at Deer Park, the dirty tricks department of the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington, District of Columbia. She'd been just 9 years old when she commenced her career as Class B FemJuve, and then she had a month and a birth year as her designate. I will not give that out because that would identify her if she still be alive. I've always given out false months and years in the past. I'm past the point of even covering. The Class B differentiated her from females raised to be assassins, suicide hookers. It made her a conventional sex slave. Femme-juve was for female juvenile. Then the month she was born in and the year. The combination of such a name would be something similar to Class B Femme-juve 879. The only mercy was that she was spared being one of America's 5-year-old baby whores in heels and makeup, all bent out of shape by steroids, estrogen, and psych conditioning. All of those either die or kill themselves by the time they reach the age of 15. She had survived to die the thalidomide death for the upper caste of officers in the U.S. military, who would pump her until she flatlined with enough poison to register as dead so they could live out their necrophiliac fantasies on her cadaver and then have John Henry Hagman reanimate her when they were done with her so they didn't have to take care of disposing of a body. Now that, in her memory, this woman who was to prove the mother of my child, now threatened with death by Matthew Schwab on a regular basis, one of my gang stalkers. In memory of her was how I understood so well the experience of Christine Johanna Hart. Christine Johanna Hart was raised in a similar nunnery in the United Kingdom, where the Roman Catholic nuns sold her out to both British and military intelligence of the United States. And she made history when she was deployed as an asset to take out the head of the Irish Republican Army. So Christine Johanna Hart has written books on this that have been published. None of this is conjecture. None of this is urban legend. None of this is Douglas Dietrich fabricating a narrative. This woman has been published and the intelligence agencies have acknowledged her service. Christine Johanna Hart took out the head of the CIA, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, seduced him, had a child by him, became pregnant with his son, before she set him up for the fall, and he was taken out. He spent the rest of his life in prison as an international terrorist. The only reason the Irish Republican Army hasn't targeted Christine Johanna Hart for death is because she's raising the son of the man who was their former leader. But if only they knew. So when Christine Johanna Hart approached myself, asking for help, asking for how to escape from the attentions of Michael Aquino, I did my best to help, always suspect that she may never have escaped his influence. That turned out to be all too true. Towards the end of my relations with Christine Johanna Hart, when she had inserted herself as a penetration agent of Michael Aquino into Revolution Radio, we were already starting to have incidents. Mike Ringley might have been controlled opposition. He may well have been former military. He had all of his faults, his psychoses. He had his medical issues, which impacted his ability to mentate, process, and think at all. He was overweight, diabetic, alcoholic. But he had been a brilliant genius in his younger days when he developed for the United States Army the sensors that changed the nature of warfare on the battlefield by sniffing out putric acid or human sweat. Now, until countermeasures were found to overcome that technology developed by Mike Ringley when he was young, the entire nature of warfare on the tactical level changed. Because of that, Mike Ringley was SS, provided such to many things, had security clearances higher than normal, and he knew of Michael Aquino. And he swore no one would ever interview Michael Aquino on Revolution Radio, that they would be fired if they did so. But at that time, one of the most desperate men in the world was working with Revolution Radio, the only rival I ever had in ratings, Sean David Morton. Now, you can watch the speakers panel on the Maggot channel. Speakers panel, Douglas Dietrich destroys Richard Dolan. You can see the culmination or the climax on Taboo Bros 2 channel. Dietrich destroys Dolan. The man who's the master of ceremonies, the MC, for that conspiracy conference, produced by Brian William Hall, who later went broke when all his money was stolen by Lori Ann Fenton, my former manageress. Of course, tagged on to me by Michael Aquino as a minder. A woman who had boasted of having sex with Max Spears when he was under hypnosis, mistaking her under a deep hypnotic trance for Sarah Rachel Adams. He would be sexually exploited by that fat bitch, Lori Ann Fenton. A sex toy to her. And Christine Joanna Hart was a sex toy. Her earliest memories in life at the age of 3. Riding up and down on Michael Aquino's cock. And so amidst all this depravity, this human sewer of shit, when she approached myself and asked for help, I desperately so wanted this to have a different ending. But in hindsight, it never could. At one point, before we severed all communications, Michael Aquino broke through into Revolution Radio. One of his cultists, a woman named Vero Albert, everyone called her Vaubert, arranged with the desperate master of ceremonies from ConspiracyCon, Sean David Morton, to change his life because the law was pursuing him for having ripped off elderly people of their life savings in a scam, an investment scam in which he said he was a psychic investor. He took all their money and ran. He made millions and millions of dollars, so much so he's made it into criminology textbooks. That heavy a hitter. He spent it all. Blew it all on coke and booze and dope and drugs and sex. And he was on his way to prison for the rest of his life, where he's rotting now. But at the time, Vera Albert at Revolution Radio said, I can help you. And Sean David Morton approached me saying, hey, Vero Vaubert, she says she can link me up to a man who can save me, Michael Aquino. I said, don't do it. But of course, he went for it. So one day, when Mike Ringley was deathly sick with influenza, then Sean David Morton told him, I'm sick too. Now, I had forewarned Mike Ringley. And Mike Ringley told Sean David Morton, you better not be interviewing Aquino while I'm sick. And Sean said, no, I'm sick too. I'm going to take the day off. I'm going to play a rerun. But while Mike Ringley was convalescing, Sean David Morton brought on Michael Aquino for his first and only appearance on Revolution Radio. Now, after that, Michael Aquino didn't need to show up himself because he had in place, as an agent in place, Christine Joanne Hart. So, when it climaxed in confrontation, it was through Christine asking again for help. People need only look on her timeline, look at her old posts, where she said she was convinced that her home was being raided on a almost daily basis, that somebody was breaking into her home, moving things, taking things, and she was convinced it's George Clooney. Of course, everybody thought her mad, but that was a symptom of something far worse. Christine Joanna Hart approached me with a problem with her son. Said, Douglas, my son's really into my pushing him around in a wheelchair when we go to the zoo and these public places in Britain. Britain's a socialized medicine state. They have free wheelchairs everywhere for people to access. When they go into places like zoos, you can just pick up a wheelchair at the gate. Her son enjoyed being pushed around like he was a baby or an infant in a carriage. So when she was pushing him around the zoo to look at the animals in this wheelchair, he was all but sucking his thumb or a pacifier. And this was when he was literally like 14, 15 years old. And she says, what bothers me the most is when I'm pushing around, he's looking at other men in the zoo and saying, I wonder how his penis would taste. And I said, look, someone's introducing your son to homosexual sex. Obviously, what's going on in the house? Then she told me she had missing time. Somebody was in. She knew they were in, messing with everything. And she was convinced it was George Clooney. I said, baby, here's what's going on. Michael Aquino was having sex with you as a child. He's having sex with your son. Your son is being provided support for a reason. We all know you live in Kensington. It's the elite neighborhood of London. It's the embassy neighborhood. It's where Julian Assange lives in his cupboard within the Ecuadorian embassy. There's no way she could afford to live there. Someone's sponsoring her. Everybody in her neighborhood assumed she was a prostitute. Had her vag hanging out the window, fucking anybody for money to support her son going to one of the elite schools in the United Kingdom. She wasn't. She was just a tool of Aquino. He maintained her because he wanted her son. I said, he just walks inside the door. He lives in Scotland now. He goes down south of the border, knocks on your door, you open it up, he snaps his fingers, you fall into a missing state, hypnagogic state, missing time. He has sex with your son, and when he walks out, he snaps his fingers again and says, I'm George Clooney. And she said, how do I get out of this? I said, you've got to separate from Michael Aquino and anyone who's speaking with him, anyone connected with him. And she said, well, that would include Heather Holman. And I said, what about Heather? And she said, well, she's my friend on Facebook, and I can't get rid of her. That'd make Aquino angry because he says Heather Holman has essentially been his care provider, and she helped him recover from his bout with colon cancer. So apparently Michael Aquino had intestinal cancer, and during that period of time, by that time, Heather Holman had become so important in his life as a sorcerer's apprentice, she was essentially acting as his care provider. So when that was presented to me, I said, you've got to block Heather Holman. You've got to get out of England, move to the United States with your son if you want this to stop. But she had a valid counter-argument. How will I make a living? What kind of quality of life will my son have? Right now, he's going to the elite school in England. He has a future. I can't get support from my terrorist husband who's rotting in the prison where they keep the IRA. I can't get support from anyone. Everyone thinks I'm insane now. all I have is my son, and what would that do to his quality of life? And I asked her, what quality of life does he have now? To grow up to be Michael Aquino's cocksucker? A Satanist in service of the dark as you yourself were all your life? You've got to change now, and you've got to change totally, or it's not going to happen. Well, she chose her path and maintained her relations with her handler, Miles Johnston, of Base's fame, the man who knew about Max Spears' death before Max Spears' own mother did, the man who exploited Max Spears' death by promoting the black goo bullshit, that the black ooze was coming out of every pore of Max Spears' body. That Miles Johnston, satanic slave bitch of Michael Aquino. So we now have full circle Heather Holman sending me the first communication she did in years. And it basically consists of a very short phrase. Message to Douglas Dietrich, mud floods. All of that has to do with Asian Lunar New Year. So when it comes to Asian Lunar New Year, the first thing I'll do, after rehydrating myself, is try to explain to you a little something about Chinese New Year. As a public service, while wishing you all a happy Lunar New Year, I'd like to educate all of you a little bit on Chinese etiquette and cultural mores. The real key, of course, is treating people with respect and just doing business. China is a culture of petty capitalism, whether you're on the mainland or anywhere else. And in terms of Chinese cultural awareness, as our brother in battle Daniel O'Roller would say, basically, don't be an asshole. Now, I'd like you to go beyond not being an asshole. We could laugh all day and riff on Chinese tattoos gone wrong, but I always leave those things to others. There's a cultural gaffe so common as to warrant a lecture about Happy New Year in China and a culturally sensitive way to express it. Now, a shout out and a kiss to our lovely lady, the adult entertainer, Moriah Mills. God bless her. A wonderful woman, the best of intents. She said, Gong hei fat choi. It's, oh my God. Gong hei fat choi. Now, when the British invaded China, established themselves in the Fragrant Harbor, that's the transliteration of Hong Kong. Its name in Mandarin Chinese is Jiàngàn. Hong Kong is a bastardization combining two factors. In the Canton region of southern China, people speak Cantonese. That's a dialect. And in terms of the Cantonese dialect, it is the universal language, practically the lingua franca, of overseas Chinese. All Chinese in general, for many generations, hundreds of years, overseas, usually came out of the southern region of China known as Canton. And they all spoke Cantonese. Now, the Cantonese dialect is brutal. It's not fit for poetry. They're not a culture of poetry or art or literature. They're a culture of kung fu films, martial arts, gang warfare. That's why out of that culture came the Shaw brothers and Bruce Lee. Now, none of that is to be decried or denigrated. It's to be admired. But another factor is, of course, the Cantonese language is the language of the Chinese mafia, the very underworld I was involved with throughout my young adulthood when I came to maturity as the White Widow, the Bai Gua Fu. So, in that culture, the British dealt with them exclusively because the British Empire was a criminal empire. The British Empire rested on the dynamics of opium and the opium trade. Out of Hong Kong, the British would go up the river tributaries to enforce opium upon everyone. Everyone in China had to take opium under British peace enforcement via what the British enforced on the Chinese people via the Opium Wars, hence the name Opium Wars. And throughout that period of time that China was engaged in an opium stupor, the British were shipping cannonball-sized balls of opium all the way up the river into the Chinese heartland. And during that period of time, the British got to learn about the language of the Cantonese. And then what happened was that the British used the English language to bastardize that Cantonese into Romanization. In other words, putting an English alphabet on the Chinese language to ape its sounds like a monkey without having to learn Chinese characters. So that's called the Wade-Giles transliteration or phoneticization system. And the Wade-Giles phoneticism is a product of British colonialism imposed upon the Chinese by force of arms after massive wars forced the Chinese to take up the opium habit. So in that horror story of colonial experience, you have this situation in which the British introduced to the world via the underworld tonkster environment of triads, the Cantonized dialectic version of Happy New Year, which is Gong Hei Fat Choi, G-O-N-G-H-A-Y-F-A-T-C-H-O-Y. It sounds offensive. It is offensive. Gong Hei Fat Choi. So here's one of those odd cultural things. You have to remember that I'm receiving emails from people who mean the best, and I get Gong Hei Fat Choi. Now, American companies send out shit like this, doing business in mainland China, not even in Guangdong, the southern province where people speak the Cantonese dialect. And so these Western folks want to be culturally sensitive. They send out a Lunar New Year message. They fuck it up every way conceivable, like Americans always do, and say Gong Hei Fat in Hong Kong Cantonese, as opposed to the Chinese language, which on both island China and mainland China, on both free China and communist China, is Putonghua Guoye, the national language of the Mandarins, the ancient caste of academics, from whence the name of the language itself be derivative. So for the vast majority of Chinese who understand the message at all, this message is seen as a brutal and nasty insult, not a positive message. It's a reminder of a former imperialist world where China was ruled from Hong Kong under gunpoint. In fact, to tell you the truth, most modern Chinese would not even know what Gong Hei Fat Choi means. They would just treat it as a series of meaningless symbols, which be insulting in its own way. Now, just so you know, Gong Hei Fat Choi is the Anglo-bastardized Wade-Giles fuckery for what the Germans later academically perfected as the Romanization of Chinese, known as the Pinyin system, while they were training the Chinese to fight World War II. The Deutsch Orient Corps, which you've never heard of. You've heard of the DAK or the Deutsch Afrika Corps under the Rommel. The Deutsch Orient Corps, or the DOK, was headed by the Field Marshal von Falkenhausen, who died the year I was born. My latent sainted Cyrus used to like to think I had taken on his reincarnated soul. Von Falkenhausen had a whole cadre of academics who properly Romanized in non-imperialist, non-colonial fashion the Chinese language. So, to say Happy New Year in the dialect of the time, that would be less offensive than the anglicized version, even if you were speaking Cantonese, would be Gong Si Fa Zai. No one in modern China says Gong Hei Fat Choi. It sounds like, come here, fat boy. The phrase is purely from the old era, which was destroyed by the new regimes. So, to reiterate for the small group of people who even know what this term means, it's a grievous insult, not a positive message. So how do you say Happy New Year in Chinese? If you've ever wondered and heard well-wishers say things like Gong Hei Fat Choi or similar greeting, and of course that's what you've heard because it's one of the most frequently uttered greetings by foreigners, it doesn't mean Happy New Year at all. If you're in need of some handy CNY or Chinese New Year greetings to say to your Chinese friends or simply want to get in on the action, some things you could say, and you don't need to worry about getting it wrong. Your friends will appreciate that you tried. I'll try and provide you some alternative greetings. But first, to finalize or drive the final nail in the coffin for Gong Hei Fat Choi, come here fat boy, saying Gong Hei Fat Choi, it's time to stop, of course, so don't ever say it at all. What it does do is deliver a wish for prosperity. It was the inspiration for Gene Roddenberry's Vulcan saying of live long and prosper. So when you say Gong Si Fa Zai, which is the correct way in the Cantonese of saying what is bastardized, vulgarized, Latinized by the fucking Brits at a gunpoint, Gong Hei Fa Choi, what you're doing, if you say it properly as Gong Si Fa Zai, is bestowing the wish that your recipient becomes wealthy in the year ahead. It's very appropriate for those in business, so it's more frequently used when greeting your work colleagues or business partners during Chinese New Year. And this Gong Si Fa Zai, it's not a hard and fast rule, but Cantonese is generally spoken in Guangdong, formerly known as Canton, and surrounding areas, as well as, of course, Hong Kong. But elsewhere in mainland China and Taiwan, the islands of Formosa, Mandarin Chinese be spoken. So if you've been saying Gong Hei Fat Choi all this time, and now you really need to know how to actually say Chinese New Year, there's about 3 main ways I can think of. And the one you use is a matter of preference or situation. Happy Chinese New Year is Xinnian Guale in Mandarin. Think Xinnian Guale. It's quite formal. It's perfect for strangers or acquaintances. You can also use the shortened version, which is Xinnian Hao, like Good New Year, which is pronounced again slowly, Xinnian Hao. This is probably the one you want to say to your friends and family if you've married into Asian. A third greeting would be Guanyan Hao. Guanyan Hao. And it's great on the very day of Asian Lunar New Year or shortly thereafter. It would be the perfect thing to say tonight. Now, Chinese New Year is also known as Chunjie, or Spring Festival. This is not preferred by myself. It's a communist term of atheists. It's similar in its insulting insinuations to happy holidays. Like when someone says happy holidays so as not to be offensive and as to be as irreligious as possible, then I respond with Merry Christmas or Happy New Year in defiance. So too, you don't want to say Happy Spring Festival because it's something a communist atheist would say if you're dealing with any real Chinese. But it is an alternative, politically correct way to wish your friends Happy New Year in communese. So instead of saying 今年过来, for example, you would say 春节过来 or Happy Spring Festival. 春节过来. Roughly, again to pronounce it, 春节过来. And similarly, 新年好 can become 春节好 or good Spring Festival. 春节好. And there you have it. 过年好 can also be replaced with 过节好, 过节好, and that can also be used for any other festival, any other holiday in China. So any holiday in China, you would say 过节好. That is acceptable, not politically correct, just plain a happy holiday for that day without the communistic influence. Now this year, it's all about the pig. This is the year of the pig. That's the year my latent Saint Iris, Diana Su Jinlin Dietrich, was born in. My mother was born in the year of the boar, the year of the pig. Now, it changes with the zodiacal fluctuations that bring us directly back to Donald Trump and the deconstruction of his state of disunion. Now, the 2019 Chinese New Year Day started on Tuesday, February 5th, just yesterday, in China's time zone. China, of course, is a nation of communist madmen, and they eliminated time zones. Whereas nationalist China, the republic thereof, into which I was born, as reestablished on the island of Taiwan, had maintained 3 time zones over China. When the communist Chinese took over, they slapped everything into slave circuit around Beijing time, declaring for all intents and purposes Mao Zedong as the new emperor of a communist dynasty. Now, the reason that's insane, there's nothing good or positive about that. As much as I argue for elimination of 4 time zones on the North American continent, all we need in the United States is 2 motherfucking time zones. China definitively needs 3. By slapping everything on Beijing time, they've alienated completely their Muslim regions in the West, because the Muslims bow towards Mecca 3 times a day, and now they have to do it on Beijing time, which means they're bowing towards Mecca in the middle of the fucking night. They have to get up in the middle of the night to take a piss to do that. So the Chinese were actively trying to destroy Islam in China by slave circuiting East Turkestan, or West China, the Xinjiang Uyghur region, to Beijing time. Now, other than that politicized aspect, yesterday was the new moon day of the first Chinese lunar month in the Chinese lunar calendar system. The exact new moon time was at 5:04 in the China time zone. This is, of course, the animal sign of the pig. It has a color among the 5 colors within the system of zodiacal reckoning. It's the brown pig. The Chinese calendar combines solar, lunar, and 60 stem branch counting systems. The 60 stem branch calendar uses the name of Yang, positive and negative, light and dark, 5 elements: metal, water, wood, fire, and earth. And 12 animals to rank the sequences. That's why it's called the zodiac, as in zoo, like zoology. There are no human or anthropomorphic representations of the zodiacal signs in Chinese culture, Sinoviet culture, Chinese or Vietnamese, or Korean or Japanese for that matter. They're all animals, hence the term zodiac. So the 12 zoological animals that rank these sequences, they are in combination with 5 elements connected to the 5 colors: white, black, green, red, and brown. So Chinese use the color animal to count the year. The name of 2019 is the female earth pig, the earth sow. Brown is connected to earth, therefore 2019 is also called brown earth sow year, brown earth pig year. The first day of the brown pig year is not the Chinese New Year day in Chinese astrology. The first day of the tiger month, because as you have 12 zodiacal signs for the years, they also comprise the hours in the months. There's 12 months, each named after an animal. There's 12 hours that circuit for a 24-hour period of 2 12-hour periods, like 12 a.m. and 12 noon, dividing 2 12-hour periods in the West. In the East, each one of those hours has its animal. All of these animals got together to be blessed by Buddha for their services to humanity. The ox, of course, is the foundation of Asian agriculture. The pig is the foundation of the Asian diet. Pork. The rat is the foundation of food in desperate times. When there's famine, the rat is always there to eat. Buddha wanted to bless the ox first in the line of animals awaiting their blessings. The rat jumped to the head of the line over the ox's horns and was blessed first. That's why 12, noon or midnight, be the hour of the rat. I myself was born at high noon, the hour of the rat in the AM hours, antemeridium or before noon hours. High noon. Now, when it comes, of course, to the control of human population, the tiger was blessed because he kept the human population in check by culling the old and the weak from the human population. The tiger too is blessed by Buddha. The first day of the tiger month be the first day of the Chinese astrology year. This day is called start of spring, which is the date when the sun enters the 315th degree on the tropical zodiac. This day be around February 4th each year, approximated. The 2019 Chinese brown pig year started the day before yesterday, February 4th, 2019, in China's single time zone as enforced by the communists. That means Chinese Lunar New Year is not the first day of the brown pig year. If a baby's born on or after February 4th, 2019, then the baby's zodiacal sign be the pig, not the dog, which is the year that just passed. Yesteryear was the year of the dog. We're transitioning from the brown earth dog to the brown earth pig. Now, all of this is rooted in China's immense history and prehistory. The Chinese know the first king of China was the Yellow King. The Yellow King became king in 2697, before there was even a concept of an emperor. 2697 before Christ. Therefore, China will enter the 4,716th year on Tuesday, February 5th, 2019. That's when we transitioned into the year 4,716 in the Chinese lunar calendar. Also, the Chinese year uses a cycle of 60 stem branch counting systems and the female earth pig be the 36th stem branch in the cycle. Since 4716 equals 60 times 78 plus 36, therefore 2019 of earth pig year be the 4716th Chinese calendar. Now, on my own promotional banner, I wrote that this year 2019 is the 4717th Chinese year. That's because I go by the imperial system. The Yellow King's inauguration was held in the spring of 2697, 2,697 years before Christ walked the earth. But the calendar of the Yellow King employed the winter solstice day as the first day of the year. The winter solstice was on around December 23rd, 2698 BC, 2,698 years before Christ. So today's January 1st means nothing to the Yellow King or the imperial calendar. Yet if we count that extra 8 days in 2698 BC for a year, then the year 2019 is the 4717th Chinese year. So 2019 is 4716 or 17 in the Chinese year, depending on whether you're using the system after the Yellow King became emperor or before. But Chinese civilization itself is at least 8,000 years old. Dadiwan Chinese relics show the civilization of houses, cooking tools, color pottery, weapons, artifacts, and agriculture. But getting back to the calendrical system, what's the meaning of the brown earth pig? ̶Hန့ being the Chinese zodiacal name of the stem branch calendar for yesteryear, 2018. Each zodiac is labeled yin-yang 5 elements. Ji is yin earth, Hai is pig. Therefore, the name of 2019 is called yin earth pig. Yin is female, yang is male. The color of earth is brown. 2019 female brown earth pig year, and the first stem branch name is found in documents around 1,739 years before Christ. The original stems and branches only were used for counting the days, but using the stem branch to count for months, hours, and year sequences began around 206 years before Christ. During the Qin Dynasty and Han Dynasty, using the seasonal changing information, the Chinese yin-yang 5-element scholars converted all zodiacal signs into 5 elements. The theory of 5 elements becomes the foundation of Chinese divination. That's what you call fortune telling. We could see the future through this system. Now, yin earth is wet soil, garden soil, or farmland. Yin earth is female and productive, can grow flowers, plants, and crops. Yin earth be the 6th element of the 10 heavenly stems. Yin earth is the flatland. My very name, yin, yi ping, means like flat and even level, as if I'm the great leveler who levels all the inequalities. It means the plains above the ground. It can tolerate when people jump and trample it. That implies a friendly attitude and love of Mother Earth. The characteristics of yin earth are steady, mild, polite, calm, and emotional. The other traits of yin earth are defiant, suspicious, jealous, stubborn, and dishonest. The flat land can be too low. Yin earth cannot see objects far away. Yin earth is lack of foresight. The color of yin earth be brown. The location of yin earth be in the center, the valley. And the pig be the last animal sign of the 12 earthly branches. Pig is in the water group, according to the Chinese 5-element theory. Water be related to wisdom. The pig is connected to river or running water. The pig has wisdom, initiative, and energy. They're the most intelligent animals on Earth, on the surface world. More intelligent, or certainly more cunning than man. have been known to beat men at checkers, and we eat them. And their body parts are so like that of a human being, we can use their porcine valves to replace our heart valves. And they're not lazy, not at all, in the Chinese cultural spectrum. The pig month is November, the first month of winter. So pig is the cold water in the winter. The Chinese I Ching presents water as connected to danger. When river water is overflowing, it causes flooding. China's rivers are its source of food and its source of famine. The sign of pig is offensive and encroachment. Pig contains mainly yang water, rushing water, with some yang wood elements. Yang wood be related to tall trees, landmarks, bosses, leaders. The characteristics of pigs are kind, generous, magnanimous, warm-hearted, considerate with leadership skill. So the yin earth pig ranks 36 out of the 60 stem branches. Yin earth be the heavenly stem, pig be the earthly branch in the Chinese zodiac calendar, and since the color of yin earth be brown, therefore yin earth pig year, the brown pig year, brings us the concept of yin earth itself, which stands for wet soil, farmland, and via the Chinese 5 elements, the pig being yang water, rushing water, the sign of the yin earth pig be that farmland be adjacent to a river. Farmland needs water for growing crops to be productive, but the river brings ever the risk of flooding. The water represents money to yin earth. The pig brings money opportunity to yin earth, but being too greedy about money might cause trouble. So yin earth be the wet farmland soil that becomes muddy when mixing with a large amount of water. The pig becomes muddy and dirty when playing around on it. It's a dirty and muddy pig year. We are in the year of the pig in Waller. My mother was born in the year of the noble war boar. This is the year of the pig in shit. Earth and water have 2 combinations in the Chinese I Ching. One be that water, like a river, flows on the ground. Water is a resource for living. People will get together around the river. This is a sign of prosperity. The other case be water running underground. People will look for water resources. Water represents danger in I Ching. This be a sign of disputation or war. Pig also contains yang wood. Yang wood is a tall tree, big wood like